In this video, we're going to look at making some links between three poems in the Power and Conflict anthology, and we're looking at the three poems that were written by the Romantic poets. When you're doing a comparison essay for poetry, a good way of looking at it is to think about the question in the same way as you would for Language Paper 2, Question 4. Because in Question 4, on the language paper, you have to compare the writer's viewpoints and methods. And that's exactly what you're doing in a poetry essay. What you need to think about is explaining to the examiner what that poet is trying to tell us about the particular topic. What is their viewpoint? What are their thoughts on that particular topic? Now, it will be something related to power and conflict, because that's the cluster that we're reading about, and that's what the poems have in common, are comments on different types of power, different types of conflict. So one way that you could look at it is if you lay it out in terms of these questions on this slide. So you could ask yourself first, what is Blake, for example, trying to tell us about power? What is he trying to say? And how does he get his point across? And then you can ask yourself, how does that compare to Shelley's thoughts on power? And how does Shelley get his point across? And if you follow that structure, same way as you would on Language Paper 2, Question 4, you will end up with a really thorough comparative essay, and you will get the marks for talking about the writer's viewpoint and also for explaining the methods that they use to get their viewpoint across. Your first task is to use these 10 words or phrases to explain what the Romantic poets thought about the nature of power. So we've been talking about all of these words in lessons recently. Your job in a moment is to pause this video, keep these words on the screen, and try and write an explanatory paragraph. Explain what Shelley, Wordsworth and Blake, in general, as Romantic poets, what did they think about power? How did they view power? What were their experiences? What was going on at the time when they were writing? So try and include all of those 10 words. Once you've done that, then you can hit play and you can see the paragraph that I put together. But have a go first. So I wrote that the Romantic poets were writing at a period of revolution, both industrial and political. The landscape in Britain was changing both physically and socially. The growth of cities and industry was matched by a growth in political and social activism. Often one developed in response to the other. Power was up for grabs, but not for everyone. The Romantics responded in different ways to this external conflict. Some retreated into the countryside, where industry could not follow so readily, and spent their days trying to place themselves both physically and metaphysically in nature, with all its sublime power. Others retreated into history, to explore ancient civilizations, to reassure them that modern corruption was a temporary blip, and that all power is transient. What they had in common was a desire to understand humanity's place in the world. As such, the Romantics can be seen as both the awestruck child and the world-weary adult, powerful in both imagination and experience. So before you start planning for your essay, a great habit to get into with revision is to try and create these kind of quadratic grids, if you like, so that you can compare writers, you can compare language in a physical way. You can look at them in relationship to each other on the page. So what I've done here is I've made a table with two different axes. So the top to bottom, we're looking at how hopeful that poet appears to be, as opposed to how despairing they are at the bottom. So we've got that word despair from Ozymandias. Obviously we know from our lessons what that means. If you're not sure, go back to your notes, look it up. But you can place Shelley, Blake and Wordsworth on that scale from hopeful to despairing. In my view, there's a very clear winner for who would be closest to despairing at the bottom, and hopefully that's clear in your mind too. Look back through your notes and have a think. Who seems to be out of these three most despairing about the world, about nature, about power, about our place in the world? Who seems to be most hopeful out of the three? And then who might you say is in the middle, kind of neutral? And then on the horizontal axis, we've got neutral to emotional. So again, Shelley, Blake and Wordsworth have very different ways of articulating themselves. They've got a very different way of putting themselves across on paper. One, again, in my mind, is far more emotional in terms of his language than the other two. One, as well, is quite neutral in general in his approach, if you like, to describing the situation in his poem. So draw out this table and place the three poets where you think they are in relation to each other on this table. Then what you can do is you can look at some quotes from the poems and place those on there too. It might be that you put Shelley in a particular box, but maybe a couple of quotes from his poem go in a different box. What that does, it allows you to see the nuances in his perspective and the variation in his approach and feelings. So place the poets, first of all, in the boxes on the grid, and then place a couple of quotes from each poem as well. See if they are the same or different to where you've put the poet themselves. So far then, we have summed up the romantic attitude towards power, what they had in common. We've started to think about differences between the three romantic poets, differences in attitude, differences in perspective. Now what you need to do is, thinking back to those original questions to structure our essay, we've got to start thinking about the methods that they use to get these points across. So in this table, down the left-hand side, I've asked you four different questions, and then at the bottom, you need to find quotes to support each of the answers to those questions. So the first question I want you to consider for each poem is, where does the power lie in this poem? So in Blake's poem, in London, the power lies in the institutions. So you've got monarchy, the military, the church, and marriage. Where does the power lie in Shelley's poem Ozymandias? And where does the power lie in Wordsworth's Prelude Extract? Second question is, who or what controls who? So who is in control of who? I've given you the example of, in Wordsworth, you could say that nature controls man, because without nature, Wordsworth wouldn't have gone down to the lake to steal the boat. Without nature, he wouldn't have rushed back home again, etc., etc. Third question, what is most powerful in this poem? So what is it that has the most power in that particular poem? And the fourth question is, how does the poet seem to feel about power? What kind of perspective, point of view do you think they've got? So Shelley, I would argue, seems to be kind of more on the hopeful end of his views of power, because he's slightly mocking the way that he's depicted Ozymandias in this way. Shows that power doesn't last forever, and the fact that he's captured that in the art form of a poem as well shows that Shelley clearly feels that art has the power to transcend time. It can transcend generations. The bottom bit is the most important bit. So the bottom row asks you to find quotes to support each of your answers above. So what you need to be able to do is find the quotes, the methods in the poem that the writer has used to get across the ideas that you've identified in those top four rows. So if you complete this table, draw it out on a piece of paper. A3 would be good, because then you've got plenty of room. You need to explain your answers in full and be absolutely clear before you move on to the next question. And make sure you then find a quote to support each of those ideas that you've had. So the final stage is to write your comparison essay. So remember, your essay response is a comparison of two poets' ideas and methods, just like in a language, paper 2, question 4. What do they think? How do they get it across? So what you can now do is transform the table on the previous slide, so the one that you've now got on paper in front of you, you can transform that into an essay on 2 of the poems. So you don't have to do all 3. Just choose 2. And then I want you to answer the question, how do the poets present their ideas on the nature of power? One thing to remember is that in your previous, in the previous slide, the work that you've done for that, you found quotes, you've got language that shows how the poet gets their point of view across. Make sure, if possible, you refer to any techniques used. So if there's a metaphor in there, if there is a simile, if there is repetition or imagery, make sure you mention that too. It's absolutely fine to just focus on specific linguistic features, but also try and look for those literary devices as well. Once you've completed your essay, if you would like to hand it in to your teacher, they can mark it and give you some feedback. And what we will then do is provide you with some example responses that you can then mark yourself, have a look at what other people are doing, and hopefully that will build your confidence in approaching one of these on your own in the future. Thanks for watching.